The lobby of the college was filled with chatter and laughter. Students moved in and out with books in their hands, and some simply sat around enjoying their free time. In the middle of the big hall stood a grand piano, polished and shining under the yellow lights. Most days it was only used during concerts or music classes, but today a small crowd had gathered around it, not for music, but for a game of pride. A young boy, nervous but trying to look confident, sat on the piano bench. His girlfriend stood behind him, her arms crossed, her smile sharp and teasing. She leaned forward and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Go on, play something, show us you can." The boy touched the keys awkwardly, pressing one here and one there, but no melody came out, only broken notes that sounded more like noise than music. The girl laughed, tossing her hair back. "Is that all you can do?" she said, her voice echoing in the lobby. "If you can't play a song, I swear I'll leave you. I don't want a boyfriend who can't even handle a piano." The crowd around them burst into laughter, some clapping, others whistling. The boy's face turned red, his fingers trembling on the keys. He wanted to impress her, but instead he was sinking deeper into shame. Students nearby stopped to watch, enjoying the drama. For them it was entertainment, something funny to gossip about later. But for the boy, it was a nightmare unfolding in front of too many eyes. He tried again, pressing more keys, but nothing came out right. The sounds clashed, making the audience laugh even louder. His girlfriend shook her head, leaning closer to the others. "I told him I wanted a man with some class," she joked. "Maybe I should look for someone else." Her words were sharp, and each one cut him deeper. He looked down at the keys, wishing they would somehow guide his hands. His ears burned with the sound of laughter. He could see his girlfriend's face out of the corner of his eye, smiling, mocking, enjoying his failure. He thought to himself that maybe she was not joking. Maybe she really would leave him. But in the far corner of the lobby, almost invisible, stood the janitor. He was an older man, dressed in plain gray overalls, holding a mop in one hand and a bucket beside him. Every day he cleaned the floors, emptied the trash, and stayed out of everyone's way. Most students never looked at him twice. To them he was part of the background, someone who belonged to the building but not to their world. Yet today, as the laughter grew louder, he stopped his work. His eyes drifted to the piano, his wrinkled hands tightened on the mop handle. For a moment his gaze softened, almost sad, as if he remembered something. The boy's broken notes must have touched an old memory, but no one noticed him, not the laughing crowd, not the arrogant girl, not even the boy on the bench. The janitor quietly leaned on his mop, listening. His eyes didn't move from the shiny, black piano. It was as though the instrument was calling to him, reminding him of a past that no one here knew, a past hidden under years of silence and dust. But instead of stepping forward, he simply waited, silent and patient, like a man used to being ignored. The girl's laughter grew even louder. She clapped her hands together as if cheering in a cruel game. "Come on. If you don't play, I'll really leave your father's house tomorrow," she said, twisting her earlier threat into a joke. The crowd howled. Some of them thought she was just being funny, but others saw the embarrassment on the boy's face and shook their heads. The boy pressed one last key, the note echoing sadly into the air. He let his hands fall into his lap. His shoulders slumped. His girlfriend sighed, clearly disappointed. "You're hopeless," she said, her voice dripping with scorn. The boy wished he could vanish into thin air. He wished the floor would open and swallow him. And through it all the janitor watched, his lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes not on the boy or the girl but on the piano itself. The crowd might have thought the moment was about the couple, about love and pride. But for the janitor, it was something else entirely. It was about the music, the instrument, the silence begging to be broken. What no one knew, what no one even imagined, was that the man with the mop had once sat at pianos like this, under brighter lights before, larger crowds. His hands had once danced across keys that sang under his touch, but time had taken that life from him. And now he swept floors instead of stages. Yet even with a mop in his hand, the piano still belonged to him. The crowd kept laughing, the boy kept shrinking in his seat, and the girl kept making sharp jokes. But something in the air had shifted. It was small, invisible, almost too quiet to notice, but it was there. The janitor's eyes had changed and the piano seemed to wait. And though no one saw it yet, the moment was coming when the laughter would stop, and the music would begin. The boy sat frozen on the piano bench, his shoulders heavy with shame. Around him, the laughter of the students echoed through the wide lobby. The sound was like waves crashing against him again and again. His girlfriend leaned back with her arms crossed, proud of her cruel little game. She whispered something to her friends, and they laughed even louder. The boy wanted to disappear, to sink under the polished piano and never be seen again. But while everyone's eyes were on the boy, one pair of eyes in the far corner told a different story. The janitor, who had been cleaning quietly, stopped moving his mop. He leaned on it, his body tired but his gaze fixed on the piano. His face was calm, almost expressionless, but his eyes betrayed a longing no one noticed. It was as if the shiny, black piano was more than wood and strings to him. It was an old friend calling from across the years. He stood there, invisible to the crowd. The students treated him like part of the furniture, just another shadow in the hall. They saw his gray uniform, his worn shoes, his bucket of dirty water, and thought nothing more. To them, he was only a man who cleaned their mess. But in that moment, he was more awake, more alive than any of the laughing voices. The boy tried again, pressing the keys, but the sound was clumsy. His fingers moved without confidence. The piano gave no melody, only dull and broken notes. The girl tapped her foot impatiently, rolling her eyes. She leaned closer and said in a sharp tone, "This is useless. I told you already. If you can't play, maybe I'll just leave you." Her words were meant to sting, and they did. The boy's jaw tightened, but his hands refused to move. Some of the students began to lose interest, but others stayed, curious to see if the humiliation would continue. They whispered among themselves, joking about the girl's threat. Some even pointed at the janitor in the corner, laughing quietly at the thought of him trying. One boy said, "Maybe the cleaner should show you how it's done." His friends laughed, thinking it was impossible, but the janitor didn't flinch. His eyes stayed on the piano, steady and strong. Inside his mind, memories stirred, memories of nights when the world was silent and only music filled the air. He remembered his own hands dancing across keys like these. He remembered the applause, the lights, the feeling of being more than a man with a mop. For a second, he almost reached out his hand toward the piano, but he stopped himself. He knew his place, or at least he had been told his place for many years. The boy on the bench lowered his head. His girlfriend's smile widened. Proud of her victory, she whispered to a friend, "See, I told you, he's no good at this." The crowd chuckled, feeding her ego, but the janitor heard none of it. His ears were filled with the ghost of melodies long gone. He could almost hear them in the silence between the laughter. He could almost feel the piano waiting for him. The janitor's mop dripped water onto the floor, but he didn't notice. His hands twitched slightly, as though remembering the shape of invisible keys. His chest rose and fell slowly, as if preparing for something. His eyes glowed with a quiet fire, the kind of fire that comes from passion buried deep but never extinguished. The girl clapped her hands together loudly. "All right, this is boring. Now," she said, "somebody else try, or maybe we should just go." Her voice was sharp, but under it there was a hint of nervousness. Maybe she felt that she had pushed too far. Maybe she worried that her boyfriend's silence was heavier than she expected. Still, she kept her chin high. She had no idea her own words had opened the door for something she could not control. The janitor shifted his weight, placing the mop carefully against the wall. He bent down slowly and straightened his back. His movements were quiet, unnoticed by most, but purposeful. A few students in the back saw him standing there staring at the piano. One of them snickered, nudging another. "Look at him, does he think he can play?" The others laughed, but softer this time, as if unsure. For the boy, the humiliation had reached its end. He rose from the bench, his face pale, his hands shaking. He whispered something to his girlfriend, but she only shrugged and looked away. His heart was heavy. He wanted to fight, to prove himself, but he couldn't. Not here, not like this. He stepped aside, his place on the bench empty. The piano, silent now, seemed almost to sigh, and in that silence the janitor's decision was made. He looked around at the laughing faces, at the boy's defeated posture, at the girl's cruel smirk, and then back at the instrument, his chest filled with something he hadn't felt in years, a mixture of courage and defiance. He knew that, if he stepped forward, people would laugh at him too. They would call him foolish, a janitor pretending to be a musician. But he also knew something else, something stronger. They didn't know who he was. They didn't know what lived inside his hands. The lobby grew quieter as the boy walked away from the piano. For the first time since the laughter had begun, there was a pause, a waiting moment, an empty space. The janitor breathed in deeply, his eyes never leaving the shining black keys. He was no longer just a man in overalls with a mop. He was someone standing on the edge of a decision. And though no one realized it yet, the silence after the boys' failure was not the end of the show. It was the beginning. The janitor's heart beat faster. His steps were slow, steady, and certain. The piano had called, and soon he would answer. The crowd had begun to grow restless. Some of the students were losing interest, but others leaned in closer, waiting for what would happen next. The piano sat quiet, its polished surface reflecting the yellow lights of the lobby. The boy who had tried to play had already stepped aside, his head lowered, his shame heavy. His girlfriend, however, was far from quiet. She stood tall, her hands on her hips, her voice sharp enough to cut through the silence. She raised her chin and smirked. "Well," she said loudly, making sure everyone could hear her. "I told him if he couldn't play, I'd leave him, and clearly he can't." Her words made the group of students laugh again. Their laughter was not as strong as before, but still cruel. The boy's cheeks flushed red, his fists clenched, but he said nothing. He wanted to defend himself, but the weight of failure pressed too hard on his chest. The girl wasn't finished. She leaned forward and spoke again, this time louder. "If someone here can really play this piano, I swear I'll respect him more than I ever respected him." She pointed toward the shiny keys as if challenging the whole lobby. Her voice carried arrogance, but also a strange kind of pride. She wanted to look powerful, as though she had control over everyone's attention. Her friends clapped their hands and cheered. "Yes, yes, let someone else try," one shouted. Another added, "Maybe there's a real man here who knows music." The words made the boy's heart sink even deeper. He stood off to the side, wishing he could disappear into the shadows. His girlfriend's laughter stung him more than any insult around them. Whispers started to move through the group. Some students looked at one another, wondering if they should try. Others nudged each other and joked. But their eyes soon shifted toward the janitor standing quietly in the corner. His mop leaned against the wall now, his hands folded in front of him, his gaze steady and unbroken on the piano. One student whispered, "What if the janitor tried?" And another burst into laughter. The idea sounded ridiculous to them. They saw his worn clothes, his tired shoes, his face lined with years of labor. To them, he was only a man who cleaned the halls, nothing more. But still, the thought lingered. The more they joked, the more they kept looking at him. The girl noticed their glances and smirked again. "Oh, maybe our janitor friend wants to try," she said mockingly, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "What do you say, sir? Do you want to impress me better than he did?" The crowd chuckled, some louder than others. The boy lowered his eyes, too humiliated to even look up. The janitor didn't move. His expression remained calm, though his heart had begun to stir. Inside, he was torn between silence and courage. His memories pressed against him. Memories of music halls, of lights shining on his face, of audiences holding their breath for the sound of his hands. He had buried that life long ago, but the piano sitting in the lobby seemed to pull it back. Note by note, the girl crossed her arms, clearly enjoying herself. To her, this was nothing but fun. A little show she had created out of boredom. She wanted someone, anyone, to sit down and prove her words true. The crowd leaned closer, waiting. Some of them wanted to laugh more, others wanted to be surprised, but all of them were curious. The boy whispered to himself, his voice barely heard. "Please stop this, just stop." His girlfriend ignored him, still playing to the audience. She tapped her foot against the floor, her voice sharp and confident. "Well then, who is brave enough?" she asked. "Who will show us real music?" The air in the lobby grew tense. The laughter that once filled the space now turned into silence mixed with whispers. The students glanced between each other and the janitor. The boy looked like he wanted to leave, but his feet wouldn't move. The girl smiled, pleased with herself. She thought she was the queen of this moment, controlling the room with her voice. But what she didn't know was that her challenge had awakened something far greater than her pride. The janitor's fingers twitched slightly at his side. His eyes never moved from the piano. It was as though the instrument was whispering his name, asking him to return, asking him to remind the world what music could truly sound like. For the first time, a few of the students grew quiet. Their eyes softened, their laughter fading as they noticed the way the janitor stared at the piano. It wasn't the look of a fool wanting attention. It was the look of someone who knew, someone who remembered. His gaze was too strong, too certain, too full of history. The girl, still smirking, didn't see it. She thought she was still in control. She thought this was just another joke to laugh about later. She leaned against the piano casually, tapping the top of it with her fingers. She looked around at the others, waiting for more laughter, more cheering, but the energy in the lobby had shifted. The crowd no longer looked only at her. They looked at the quiet man in the corner. They looked at the mop leaning against the wall, at the old shoes worn from years of work, and at the eyes that never moved from the piano. Something was building, slow but powerful, hidden in plain sight. And in that silence the piano seemed to wait too, its keys untouched, its strings quiet as though holding its breath. The crowd didn't know it yet, the girl didn't know it, and even the boy didn't see it. But the game had changed. The challenge that began as a cruel joke had opened a door, and soon the janitor would step through it. The air in the lobby felt heavy now. The laughter that had once filled the room was no longer loud. Instead, a strange silence settled over the group. The boy stood off to the side, defeated, his girlfriend still smirking, proud of her cruel words. The piano sat untouched, its surface shining under the light, almost waiting for someone brave enough to sit down. Then, slowly, the janitor moved. At first it was just a small step, quiet, unnoticed by most. His old shoes scraped softly against the floor. He straightened his back, setting aside years of silence. His eyes stayed fixed on the piano, as if nothing else in the world mattered. He walked with purpose, though his steps were calm, steady, almost too calm for what he was about to do. A few students noticed and whispered. One nudged another and pointed. "Look, he's going to the piano." The whisper spread quickly, and soon everyone turned. The crowd parted a little, their voices hushed in disbelief. The girl laughed again, loud and sharp. "Oh, this is Rich. The janitor thinks he can play," she said. Her friends giggled nervously, not as confident as before. The janitor ignored them. He had spent years ignoring voices like that, years of being invisible in the same halls. His hands, rough from work, twitched slightly, as though already remembering the feel of keys beneath them. He reached the piano and placed one hand gently on the polished wood. His touch was soft, almost respectful, like greeting an old friend after a long time apart. The boy's heart pounded as he watched. He didn't know why, but he couldn't look away. He saw something in the janitor's movements, something quiet but powerful, something that made him forget his own shame for a moment. The girl, however, rolled her eyes. "This will be embarrassing," she whispered loudly. "He's going to make it worse." But the janitor didn't hear her, or maybe he did, but it no longer mattered. He pulled the bench out slowly and lowered himself onto it. His posture changed the moment he sat down. His shoulders straightened, his chin lifted. It was as though the man who had walked in with a mop had been replaced by someone else entirely. The crowd leaned in closer, their curiosity now stronger than their laughter. Some of them expected him to press the wrong keys, to make a fool of himself. Others, though, felt a strange sense of anticipation. Something about the way he carried himself told them this was not a joke, not a mistake. The The janitor wiped his hands on his old work shirt. His fingers looked rough, marked by years of cleaning floors and lifting heavy buckets. But when he raised them over the keys, they no longer looked clumsy. They hovered above the piano with a kind of grace, light and sure, as if they already belonged there. The girl crossed her arms and smirked, whispering to her friends, "Just wait, he'll hit the wrong note." But her voice trembled slightly. She too felt the shift in the air, though she didn't want to admit it. The boy, standing to the side, couldn't take his eyes off the janitor. He felt like something important was about to happen, something that would change the way everyone in that room thought. The janitor closed his eyes for a moment. His chest rose and fell slowly. He remembered the stages he once stood on, the lights, the applause, the music that had once been his life. He remembered the silence that had followed when that life ended, and now, with the piano in front of him again, he felt the silence break even before a single note was played. He let his fingers fall gently on the keys, not pressing yet, just touching. The lobby was so quiet that even the smallest sound of his skin brushing the keys could be heard. The students held their breath, waiting. Some leaned forward, others covered their mouths, unsure if they were about to laugh or gasp, and then, with a calm confidence, the janitor pressed down. The first sound that came out was soft, almost like a whisper, but it carried through the hall. It was not clumsy, not broken, not noise. It was music, pure and delicate. The kind of sound that instantly demanded silence. The girl's smirk faltered. Her eyes widened slightly. Her friends stopped giggling, their faces turned serious. The boy's heart jumped. He felt goosebumps rise on his skin. He knew, in that very first note, that this man was not what they thought he was. The janitor's hands moved to the next keys, slow, steady, sure. Each sound was clearer than the last. His shoulders relaxed, his body falling into a rhythm it had not known for years but had never forgotten. The crowd stood still, caught between disbelief and awe. No one laughed now. No one whispered. They only listened. The girl shifted uncomfortably. She wanted to say something, but the words caught in her throat. The sound coming from the piano was undeniable. It was real. It was powerful. And it was beautiful. She had mocked the janitor, but now she was forced to face something she didn't understand. The janitor opened his eyes, looked at the piano, and let his hands glide across the keys. His fingers, though rough, moved with elegance. He was no longer a man in old shoes and a dirty uniform. He was a pianist, and the lobby was his stage. The students stared, their mouths slightly open. They had expected failure, but instead, they were witnessing something unforgettable. The janitor didn't just sit down at the piano. He claimed it, and with every note he played, the room belonged to him. The janitor's fingers pressed the first real chord, and the sound spread through the lobby like a wave. It was soft but strong, clear and alive. For a moment, the students forgot to breathe. They had expected a mistake, an awkward noise that would make them laugh again. But instead they heard beauty. The melody began slowly, gentle as a whisper, but filled with confidence. It wasn't random notes. It wasn't clumsy pressing, it was music, real music, the kind that pulled at the heart and demanded silence. The janitor leaned forward slightly, his body moving with the rhythm. His eyes half closed, as if he was no longer in the lobby but somewhere else, somewhere far away where only the music mattered. The students froze, staring at him. His rough, calloused hands no longer looked like the hands of a cleaner. They moved across the keys with ease, flowing like water, each note connected to the next, building something greater. The sound filled every corner of the lobby, climbing the walls, and echoing through the ceiling. At first, some of the students exchanged confused glances. Was this really happening? Was this man, this janitor, playing like a professional? But as the melody grew stronger, their doubts melted away. The truth was clear. He wasn't just good, he was brilliant. His fingers danced across the keys, with speed and precision, yet every movement looked effortless. The boy who had been humiliated stood frozen, his shame replaced by awe. He watched the janitor's hands and felt goosebumps on his arms. This was what music was supposed to sound like. Not broken notes, not mistakes, but a story told without words. His humiliation no longer mattered, because now he too was caught. In the spell, the girl's smirk disappeared completely. Her eyes widened, her lips slightly parted. She tried to laugh again, but no sound came out. The music was too strong, too undeniable. It wrapped around her pride and crushed it, forcing her to see what was right in front of her. This man she had mocked, this janitor she thought beneath her, was producing music she could never dream of. The janitor's posture had transformed. Gone was the man who bent over floors and carried buckets. Sitting at the piano, he was someone else entirely. His back straight, his shoulders relaxed, his fingers moving with grace. He looked like he belonged there, as though he had been waiting all his life for this moment. The melody rose higher, filling the air with energy. The students leaned forward, pulled into it. They could feel the story inside the notes, a story of struggle, of pain, of joy, and of something eternal. The janitor was not just playing keys, he was speaking through them, speaking in a language they didn't know but could feel deep in their hearts. One girl in the back whispered, "He's amazing." Her voice was trembling. Another nodded, unable to look away. Even the ones who had laughed the loudest now stood in stunned silence. The janitor had taken the piano, and with it, he had taken the room. The boy's girlfriend shifted uncomfortably. Her arms that had been crossed so tightly now fell to her sides. She glanced around, hoping someone would still laugh, but no one did. All eyes were on the janitor. All ears were on the music. Her power over the crowd was gone. The only power now belonged to the man at the piano. The janitor's hands moved faster, yet they never faltered. Each note was perfect. The sound was smooth, flowing like a river that could not be stopped. His body moved with the rhythm, his head nodding slightly, his face calm but alive with focus. It was clear this wasn't luck. This was skill. Skill shaped by years of practice, by nights of dedication, by a past he carried silently. The melody slowed for a moment, soft and gentle again like a lullaby. The sudden change made the crowd hold their breath, afraid to even move. The silence around the notes was as powerful as the sound itself. It made their hearts ache. It made them wonder who this man really was, what story his music was telling. Then, with a graceful shift, the melody swelled again, louder, brighter, stronger. It filled the lobby with light even though the sun outside was setting. The janitor's fingers blurred with speed, but every note was clear, every sound was sharp, perfect, alive. It was more than talent. It was mastery. The boy felt tears sting his eyes. He wasn't jealous anymore. He wasn't humiliated. He was inspired. He whispered softly to himself, "I want to learn. I want to play like that." His girlfriend heard him, but for the first time, she had nothing clever to say. She too was lost in the music. The students, who had been leaning casually against the walls, now stood straight, some with hands over their mouths, others with their eyes wide. They were witnessing something they would never forget. The janitor was no longer invisible. He was no longer the man who mopped their halls quietly. He was an artist, and in that moment, he belonged to the piano, and the piano belonged to him. The last few notes of the first piece began to fade, slow and delicate. The sound lingered in the air like a whisper refusing to leave. The janitor lifted his hands slowly from the keys, letting the final chord echo through the lobby. The silence that followed was deafening. No one spoke, no one laughed, no one moved, and then, without warning, the crowd burst into applause. Their claps filled the lobby, bouncing off the walls, louder than their earlier laughter but filled with awe, not mockery. The boy clapped the hardest, tears in his eyes. His girlfriend joined in, though her face burned with shame. She had mocked him, but now she had to bow to his brilliance. The janitor, however, didn't smile. He only nodded slightly, his face calm, as if he had expected nothing. Else he had played not for them, not for applause, but because the piano had called him back, and he had answered, The sound of applause still echoed in the lobby, but the janitor was not finished. He let his rough hands rest gently on the keys again, and without saying a word, he began to play another piece. This time the notes rose faster, brighter, more powerful. The melody soared high, and the students who had been clapping immediately fell silent again, drawn back into the spell. His fingers moved across the piano with such speed that some could hardly believe their eyes. It was like watching water flow, smooth and unstoppable, but every note was precise, perfect, sharp. His body swayed with the rhythm, his eyes half closed, his face calm. For him, this was not performance. This was breathing. This was life itself. The students leaned closer. Every sound pulled them in deeper. The boy who had once felt humiliated now stood at the very front of the group, his eyes wide, his heart pounding. He whispered softly, "How can he play like this?" But no one answered. They were too busy listening. The girl who had mocked him before pressed her lips together. Her arms, once confidently crossed, now hung loosely by her sides. She wanted to laugh, to make another cruel remark, but she couldn't. The music had stolen her words. It had stripped her pride and replaced it with awe. She couldn't look away. Her eyes followed the janitor's hands as they moved like lightning across the keys. The piano no longer sounded like an instrument in a college lobby. It sounded like an orchestra, full and alive. Every note rang out with emotion, joy, and sorrow mixing together. The janitor's hands told a story that words never could. The students felt it in their hearts. Some felt goosebumps rise on their skin. Others felt tears sting their eyes. They didn't know why, but the music reached inside them, touching places they didn't even know existed. One student whispered to his friend, "This is unbelievable. He's better than anyone I've ever heard." His friend nodded without speaking. They both knew they were witnessing something rare, something unforgettable. The janitor's movements were steady and sure. He was not a man fumbling with talent. He was a master, a man who had lived inside music for years. Though he wore an old uniform and held a mop hours before, none of that mattered now. In this moment, he was a musician, a performer, an artist, whose hands had once belonged on stages. The boy's shame had completely disappeared. In its place grew inspiration. He thought about the piano differently now. It wasn't just an instrument he had failed at. It was a voice, a language, a way. To speak without words, he felt something inside him wake up, a desire to learn, to become better, to touch people the way this man was touching everyone in the lobby. The girl swallowed hard, her throat tight. Her earlier words, her threats, her laughter, echoed in her mind, and each one made her face burn hotter. She had mocked her boyfriend, mocked the janitor, mocked music itself, and now she stood silent, powerless, stripped of her pride. She could not deny what she was hearing. The man she thought was nothing had shown her what true greatness was. The melody changed again, slower now, softer. Each note stretched into the air like a sigh. The janitor leaned back slightly, his eyes closed, his fingers gliding gently. He played not for them, not for applause, but for himself, for the love of music that had never died in his heart. He played as though he were remembering someone, something, a life long gone but still alive in his soul. The students stood still, holding their breath, afraid to break the fragile magic that filled the room. Even the sound of someone shifting their feet felt too loud. The boy's eyes shone with tears. His girlfriend bit her lip, ashamed of how she had acted. The crowd that had once laughed now looked at the janitor with respect, with wonder, with something close to reverence. As the melody grew again, stronger and brighter, the room seemed to change. It no longer felt like a college lobby. It felt like a theater, like a sacred place where music ruled. The students weren't just witnesses. They were part of something bigger, something they would carry with them forever. The janitor's rough hands, worn from years of hard work, moved gracefully, as if they had never left the piano. His body seemed lighter, freer, as though the weight of his daily life had vanished with each note he played. For a few minutes, he wasn't a janitor. He wasn't invisible. He was the man he had once been. The man he had always been inside. When the last notes of the second piece began to fade, the lobby was so quiet it felt unreal. The sound lingered in the air like a memory that refused to die. His fingers lifted from the keys slowly, gently. His hands rested in his lap, but the silence after the music felt louder than any noise. No one moved, no one spoke. The student stood frozen, as if trapped between reality and a dream. Then slowly, someone began to clap. One pair of hands. Then another until the lobby was filled with applause again. Louder this time, stronger, filled with respect, not surprise. The boy clapped with all his strength, his heart racing. His girlfriend clapped too, but her face was red with shame, her eyes wet. She knew she would never forget this moment. The crowd that had once mocked now bowed in admiration. The janitor, however, only nodded again, his expression calm, his eyes soft. He had not played for them. He had played because he couldn't hold it inside any longer. The piano had called, and he had answered. The music was his truth, and tonight he had spoken it. The last notes of the song faded into silence. The janitor let his hands fall into his lap, breathing slowly, his face calm but his eyes deep, as though he had just traveled through time. The lobby remained frozen for a moment, then the silence shattered and applause exploded louder than before. The students clapped, cheered, even whistled. Their voices filled the air with excitement. They had come expecting laughter, but instead, they had witnessed greatness. Some clapped with wide smiles, others with tears in their eyes. The boy clapped the hardest, his shame long forgotten. He wasn't thinking of his failure anymore, only of the miracle he had just seen. His girlfriend. Red-faced, forced herself to clap too. Her hands moved, but her pride was gone. She couldn't meet the janitor's eyes. Someone in the crowd called out, "Who are you?" Another shouted, "How can you play like that?" Questions poured from every corner. The students leaned closer, eager to hear his answer. They had seen janitors before, but never like this. Never as masters of something so beautiful. The janitor sat quietly for a moment, his hand still resting gently on the piano. He didn't speak right away. His silence only made the students lean in more. Finally, he lifted his head, his voice calm, steady, but filled with weight. "I used to play," he said softly. "Long ago, I played in theaters, on stages, in front of crowds larger than this one." Gasps spread through the lobby. The students looked at one another, surprised. The boy's eyes widened. The girl's smirk completely vanished. She felt her throat tighten, embarrassed by the memory of her laughter. You were a pianist," one student whispered. The janitor nodded. "Yes, once I was. Music was my life. It was everything. But life has a way of taking things from you when you least expect it." His eyes drifted down to his hands, worn and rough. "I lost it all," he continued. "The concerts, the lights, the applause, one by one they disappeared. I had family to feed, bills to pay, mouths to take care of. The music could not feed them, so I set it aside. I found work where I could. And here I am now, keeping these halls clean, sweeping your floors, emptying your trash, invisible to most." The students were silent. Their earlier arrogance felt heavy now. They realized they had walked past him countless times without seeing him, never once thinking that he had a story, a past, a life beyond the mop in his hand. The boy felt shame wash over him, not for his own failure, but for the way they had treated this man. The girl shifted nervously, her face pale. Her laughter from earlier echoed in her head like poison, but the janitor did not speak with bitterness. His voice carried no anger, only truth. "I gave up the stage, but I never gave up music. It has lived inside me all these years, waiting, always waiting. Tonight, when I heard the laughter, when I saw this piano sitting here, I could not stay silent any longer. The music wanted to live again, so I let it." The student stared. His words struck them deeper than the music itself. They realized that talent, real talent, never dies. It only waits for its moment. And they had just witnessed that moment. The boy stepped forward, his voice trembling. "Sir, you were incredible. I want to learn. I want to play like that. Can you teach me?" His eyes shone with hope. The janitor looked at him with surprise, then smiled gently. "If you are willing to work, if you are willing to respect the music, then yes, I can." The boy's girlfriend looked down at the floor, ashamed. She had been cruel, proud, and shallow, and now she felt smaller than ever. She wanted to apologize, but her pride held her back. Instead, she whispered quietly, "I'm sorry," though her voice was almost too soft to hear. The janitor did not answer her. He didn't need to. The music had already done it for him. The applause continued, but now it was different. It wasn't just for his playing, it was for his story, for his strength, for his quiet dignity. The students who had mocked him now looked at him with respect, their laughter replaced with admiration. They knew they would never forget this night. For the janitor, it wasn't about pride. It wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about remembering who he was, about letting the music breathe again. He stood slowly from the bench, his body old but his spirit alive. He placed his hand gently on the piano one last time, whispering softly, "Thank you." Not to the crowd, but to the instrument itself. The boy watched him with awe. The girl lowered her eyes. The students remained quiet now, respectful. The janitor's truth had been revealed, and it had humbled them all. He was not just a man with a mop. He was an artist, a master, a soul who had carried music in silence and finally let it out. And in that lobby filled with young voices and restless laughter, his story had become a lesson that greatness can hide in plain sight, that respect should never be measured by uniforms or titles, but by the strength of what lives inside. The lobby was still buzzing after the janitor's performance. The piano, which had been silent for so long, now felt alive, as though it had been waiting for this exact night. The students stood around quietly, their faces full of awe. The laughter that once filled the air was gone, replaced by respect. Some still clapped softly, others simply stared, unable to put into words what they had just witnessed. The janitor rose slowly from the bench, his movements calm, unhurried. He placed one hand on the polished surface of the piano, his rough fingers tracing the edge gently. It was as if he was saying goodbye to an old friend. For him, the music had not been about showing off or teaching a lesson. It had been about answering a call, about letting the voice inside him speak once more. The boy stepped forward first. His heart was still racing, his eyes wide. He had come into the lobby feeling proud, then humiliated. But now he felt something entirely new, inspiration. He looked at the janitor and said, "Thank you, sir. I will never forget this. You've shown me what music really is." His voice trembled with emotion. The janitor gave him a small smile, nodding gently. "Respect the music, and it will respect you," he replied. The girl, however, could not lift her eyes. Her earlier laughter and cruel words played in her mind like broken echoes. She had mocked her boyfriend. She had mocked the janitor. She had mocked something she did not understand. Now her face burned with shame. She took a step forward, her voice soft. I was wrong," she whispered. The words barely left her lips, but they were heavy with truth. She wanted to say more, to apologize, but her throat felt tight. Her pride, once so strong, had been shattered by the music. The janitor didn't scold her. He didn't need to. He simply looked at her for a moment, his expression calm, almost forgiving. The silence between them spoke louder than any words. She lowered her head, tears stinging her eyes. For the first time, she realized how shallow she had been. She realized that greatness had nothing to do with appearances, but with what lived in the heart. Around them, the students whispered to one another, but this time their voices carried respect, not mockery. "I can't believe it," one said. "All this time, he was here, and we never knew." Another added, "We walked past him every day, and none of us ever thought twice. We were blind." Their words carried guilt, but also admiration. They understood now that they had learned something bigger than just music. The boy looked at his girlfriend, his eyes serious. "You laughed at me," he said quietly. "But you laughed at him too. Do you see now? Do you see how wrong that was?" She nodded slowly, unable to argue. Her pride had melted away completely. She whispered again, "I was wrong. I will never laugh like that again." The boy looked back at the janitor, his respect for him greater than anything he had ever felt for anyone before. The janitor slowly picked up his mop from where he had left it. His hands, which had just created magic, now held the tool of his daily labor. The contrast was sharp, but somehow beautiful. He didn't look ashamed. He didn't look smaller. He simply looked like himself, a man who carried music in his soul, no matter what work he did. The students watched him, some with tears in their eyes. They realized that this was not just about a song, it was about life, about humility, about hidden greatness. They would carry this memory with them for years, telling others about the night the janitor sat down at the piano and changed everything. The girl finally stepped back, her pride broken, but her heart changed. She whispered to her friends, "We judged him without knowing him, and look who he really is. We should be ashamed." Her words were honest, and for once they carried no arrogance, only truth. The boy, still standing close, turned to the janitor once more. "Sir, will you play again someday?" he asked. His voice full of hope. The janitor smiled faintly. "Music comes when it wants to," he said softly. "Tonight it wanted to, and tonight it spoke. That is enough." The crowd slowly began to leave the lobby, but they left differently than they had entered. They left quieter, humbled, carrying a story in their hearts. The girl who had once laughed walked beside her boyfriend silently, holding his hand this time, her face lowered in shame. The boy walked taller, not because he had won anything, but because he had learned something far greater. The janitor stood alone for a moment, his mop in one hand, his eyes on the piano. He whispered quietly, "Thank you, old friend," and then turned back to his work. For him, the music would never die. It lived inside him, waiting, always waiting, ready to return whenever it was called. And so the night ended not with laughter, but with respect. The piano remained silent once more, but everyone who had been there would remember its voice. They would remember the man who revealed his truth. The janitor who was never just a janitor, but a musician, a teacher, and a reminder that greatness often hides in the places no one dares to look.